We ask you that you will give wisdom, ability, sound judgment, and honorable purpose to those who govern and represent the citizens of this land. The task is difficult. The duties are many, and the responsibility is heavy. Therefore, we pray for our elected leaders gathered in this chamber and all who assist their work. As your people, Lord God, renew our faith, strengthen our hope, enlighten our understanding, and enlarge our charity. Through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Say the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever.
This House is now in session. Minutes of Tuesday, 10th of July 2018.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the minutes be adopted.
If there are no corrections or observations, let those minutes stand confirmed.
Messages from His Excellency the Governor General, petitions, papers, government notices.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that standing orders number 6, 16, 18, 20, 42, subsection 5, 43, and 44 be suspended for the remainder of the day's sitting.
The question is that those aforementioned standing orders be adjourned for the remainder of the day's sitting. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. The government business is the order of the day.
Order number 1, sir. In the name of the Honourable Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs, to resume debate on the Integrity in Public Life Bill 2018.
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, sir. I still am getting accustomed to looking at you and calling you Mr. Speaker, sir, and it is a delightful thing. I, sir, rise in this debate just to share a few perspectives because I think that we are all settled that this piece of legislation is critical not just to the tone of the government that I want to lead, but equally to the integrity and health of the country in which we live. Our journey thus far as a nation has not seen a formal interplay between the members of this parliament and the members of the executive and the formal requirements that we are now asking for in this legislation with respect to conduct at an individual level and the disclosure of assets, and indeed the level of accountability which is now being asked of those who come to public life, even outside of this chamber. And so we do so conscious that in the early stages of this transition to a new framework, that there will be those who will be reluctant to want to serve, because in a small society, the notion of having to disclose one's business to any entity that is outside of your job or your family or even your church is something that may be a load too heavy to bear for some of our citizens because they are simply not accustomed to it. Indeed, sir, it brings to mind why a previous Barbados Labour Party's attempt to pass this legislation never got anywhere. And it was because of the Senate, not the lower house. Legislation passed in the lower house under Tom Adams. But it was stalled in the Senate because it could not get the requisite majority, and indeed it was the independent senators who said enough is enough. And at that stage, the legislation stopped. I have every confidence, sir, that the leader of the opposition has 2 members in the Senate and will ensure that when it gets there, that this time it will not pass, if only because his signature to the document which commits to this bill was strong. And I know that he has influence over both of his senators to ensure that the requisite constitutional majority is obtained to the extent, I don't think it is needed in this. Yes, it is. It is, because we want to give it the constitutional protection. So I have every confidence that the leader of the opposition will ensure that the fate that befell my predecessor in this party will not befall myself as we seek to make this bill law in our land. But as I say so, sir, let us also be real. And even in the construction of boards as we speak, there have been some persons who have therefore said, we are prepared to serve as members, but we may not be able to serve as chairman because of how we hold our assets in common with other people. And while they may be prepared for the disclosure, the common ownership in which they hold assets means that they have to check with the other person. And in many instances, other people are saying, no, we are not prepared to go there. And this is not unique to Barbados, sir. This has happened in other territories. Indeed, it was the reason why the then Prime Minister, who is no longer with us, and I refer to the then member for St. John, the Honourable David Thompson, said in an interview before his passing that he was having difficulty pushing forward the notion of the legislation because of the extent to which people were not prepared to serve in this country as a result of it. Sir, for him and for those who succeeded him in the Democratic Labour Party, that became an obstacle. For us, sir, it cannot be an obstacle. It is an unfortunate event, but one that is entirely understandable, where you are breaking new ground and introducing a new culture. You know, sir, and I use a completely different metaphor. When we were growing up, and indeed our parents and our grandparents, the one thing that people did not talk about in this country and in this region is mental health. Never talked about it. It was taboo. But as we move around and talk to young people, not just locally, but even regionally in the preparation for the CARICOM meetings, the one thing that young people want put fully and squarely on the table are issues of mental health. So that values and perspectives change and shift. And I have every confidence that once we stay the course with respect to what is expected of us when we hold positions of trust, be they formally in government or be they in the church, or be they in non-governmental organizations, that these new standards of conduct shall become part and parcel of the landscape and shall therefore not appear to be unusual or extraordinary 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now. And why do we do it, sir? There is a cost to corruption. And the cost is that if I have to spend the money in areas where a person has chosen to spend it because of their corrupt activity, then it means the money can't be spent on the things that we want genuinely to be able to do as a government. We can't spend it in being able to improve the lot of those whose pension may not be sufficient to allow them to keep body and soul together. We can't spend it with respect to creating the opportunities for young people, many of whom in this country, as I said, the thing that has disturbed me most in this journey was the recognition of the numbers of young people who have left school and who for 6 years, 7 years, 8 years never kept or never had a job, a full-time job. Might get an odd job here or odd job there. But sir, you in another life ran a post-secondary institution that was designed to create opportunities for young people and older people who may have passed that. And it was about creating a platform to allow aspiration to become reality. And when we have a country that hitherto was able, in its years of independence, to provide for its citizens, now finding that in the last 7, 8 years, that almost half of the people leaving school, 4,500 or so leave school a year. We're not able to find opportunities in this country in terms of regular employment, even if, sir, they went into post-secondary training or genuine tertiary training. I have, sir, a document on my desk that I brought down this morning. A young lady studied in Canada, came back here, could not get anything for the last 3, 4 years. And in spite of that, she has reached out to me to share her perspective on what Barbados' future economic development should look like, because they want to participate. But when we engage in corrupt practices, Mr. Speaker, the money is diverted from those noble activities that ought to be the subject of a government's focus and spent in the pockets of someone who ought to know better and for whom this now becomes the ultimate breach of trust, because they were not put there to engage in malfeasance, misfeasance, or simple stealing. This is what this is about. Now, we are not trying to be sanctimonious, but we are trying to lay a line in the sand. And we are simply saying, sir, that there are standards. To whom much is given, much is expected. And, you know, sir, in 2008, July, when I had the first opportunity to lead as leader of the Barbados Labour Party, in my first encounter in the budget debate, I indicated then that I felt that this moment would come with respect to the passage of this legislation. I felt that it was critical for those who serve in high office, and I felt that I would reinforce my commitment to it by declaring my assets to the country at that time. I'm not asking anyone else to have done that, but I wanted to draw attention to the fact that you can't cloister yourself in private but want to serve in public office. And to that extent, sir, what this legislation seeks to do first and foremost is to establish an integrity commission in the same way that we established an electoral and boundaries commission that is clothed with constitutional protection. to establish an integrity commission that will have as its members people of eminent integrity themselves, and people who understand the importance of discretion and confidentiality in a small society. Part of our difficulties in a small society is managing what I call the sociology of smallness, that everybody's related, that everybody knows one another. And there will inevitably be some difficulties, and hence discretion and wisdom are also critical. I don't know how many people in Barbados are related, but I do know that you can't go far without finding somebody who is related or who went to school with somebody. And therefore, how we manage issues of conflict and how we manage relationships in the context of a small society requires a greater degree of discretion than would otherwise be the case in a large country where there is complete arm's length relationships in almost every instance. And we're conscious of that. And some have even suggested that that is why in the past others did not proceed also with alacrity in the establishment of institutions such as this. We get it, we understand it, but we say in spite of it, we must manage to literally put in place this framework because the country needs it now and people must be held accountable. It burns my soul, sir, every time I see people who are voiceless and people who have no money or power connections finding themselves before the courts for all kinds of things, and those who clearly have stepped on the line, who clearly have transgressed, find themselves, sir, watching on as if they are innocent spectators. And this is what destroys people's belief and hope in a society. This is what removes from people the urge to want to participate. And when all is said and done, sir, the mission of nation building requires the majority of us moving in the same direction. But if people are despondent or if people lose hope because they believe that there are two sets of laws, or as Adonijah has sang so brilliantly, that there are two Barbadoses, then this is why we don't get people moving in the same direction and we don't get many hands making light work. And I feel, sir, that this piece of legislation tangibly represents this government's commitment to having one Barbados, to having one set of a framework that unites us all in accountability and what is right. And what is more, sir, is that when we launched the Covenant of Hope, people thought that it was just an idle exercise. And I'm going to repeat it every time I stand from this chair. There is nothing idle about what the Barbados Labour Party committed to at Solidarity House when we launched the Covenant of Hope. There was nothing idle. There was nothing idle about what the annual conference of the Barbados Labour Party, the highest decision-making body of the party, agreed to when it agreed at Foundation School in October 2015 to the Covenant of Hope. Politics and representation must stand for something, and the platform upon which it stands is first and foremost values. Are we perfect? No, we're not. Will people transgress? More likely than not. But if they do so willingly, and continue in particular to do so, then the state must hold them to account. And sir, it's first and foremost, therefore, about making sure there is one Barbados, one set of rules and one set of laws to which we are all bound. Does this society admit that a person can be rehabilitated? Yes, they do. That's why we have the expungement of records in our country. And that is legislation that I believe that the Attorney General will at a soon time look at to be able to expand, because we believe people must be given a second chance. We believe that people must not be condemned to purgatory forever and ever and ever. But we believe too that people must pay a price for the actions that they make, because accountability is critical. Now, for me at a personal level, sir, I feel strongly that having asked people to do that, that it is always better for people to come forward and say, look, I fell down. Look, I did wrong. Look, I did the wrong thing. I shouldn't have done this. Because when people do so, and I come from the perspective of someone who used to practice criminal law, and you too, sir, those who throw themselves at the mercy of the court are treated how? With mercy, more often than not. Those who recognize that there's a cost and time to investigation, and who are prepared to obviate that route, to remove from the state that cost, the court recognizes it and treats them with a level of leniency that they don't treat a person who has been found guilty. And I have struggled at night for the last year on where do we land in this. And I understand the population wants blood. I understand it, because the population feels aggrieved that the sense of all-out plundering, I'm not going to say thieving, that's for the evidence to come, but that the extent to which public institutions no longer resemble what they ought to resemble because of activities that took place. People are angry. And they're angry because they've had to bear a burden while seeing all of this unfold. And I struggle at night, because I remember in the book of Romans, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. This is not about vengeance, but this is about setting a line in the sand for accountability. I'm equally conscious that a country or a government that becomes obsessed with multiple commissions of inquiry and looking behind them, what has happened throughout the region? That, and that's, you see, and that's ultimately what we face. That you can use your energy how you choose to deploy it. And while we must make sure that there is accountability without doubt, this government must never become so obsessed with anything that approaches a level of vengeance that it forgets to do what it has to do to move the people of this country forward in a way that is sustainable. And that is my job, I believe, as Prime Minister of this country, to ensure that even though we hold people accountable, that this government must never become consumed with wanting only to achieve a level of vengeance or a level of we can get you, while at the same time then the same young people that I talk about who can't find a job are left on the sidelines yet for another 5 years or another decade. So that whatever we do has to flow from the evidence. And if the evidence is there, we will deal with it. And the Attorney General has indicated that upon his desk has already fallen a lot of things that require further investigation. And he has, in his wisdom, to ensure that without prejudice to the establishment of this Integrity Commission, that those things that have fallen below the standard of conduct required by the law ought to be dealt with. At the same time, I believe that our approach to transparency and accountability is something that we have to remain committed to. And you will note, therefore, that in almost every instance, I have tried to say to the country, even when it appears as though we have made a mistake or fallen, as we did with the constitutional amendment and the 2 senators, there is nothing to be gained by anything called a cover-up, however innocent or however conniving. Nothing. And this is the example that we want to set our young people, because young people respond also to the examples that lie before them. And that's why I say you can't have 2 Barbaduses. You can't. And I hope that we will act in a way, therefore, that recognizes that none of us are perfect. But what we must have is a commitment to hold people accountable and to be transparent in our dealings. Sir, I wish that this transparency could have been reflected even in the conduct of this Parliament. It is of great, great concern to me that even in the very highest court of the land, that a person who previously sat in your chair could find themselves signing contracts without tender. Contract, I can't say plural, without tender. Preparing the legal contract themselves. Uniquely leaving off the drawn and prepared because they know that they could not allow a drawn and prepared to go on that document. And purporting to issue a contract on the 1st of January 2017 that would see a contractor receive $23,000 for every day that the House of Assembly met, and $17,000 for every day that the Senate met. So that if both met in 1 week, they would receive $40,000 without this going to tender. Now, sir, running an institution does cost money. And running an institution does create opportunities for goods and services to be supplied. We get that. And we get that there may be people who they may want, even if that's what the Speaker wanted. But all of us who
Honourable Prime Minister, the former Speaker.
The former Speaker, sir. Very clear, sir. Very, very clear to that, and I apologize, sir. But the point is this, sir. There's a process. We cannot be lawmakers and lawbreakers too. And what is the tune? So that if the House met 5 times in a month, that's $200,000 in a month, the House and the Senate. Or if they met as they do at estimates, and they did in February of this year, that's $200,000. Sorry. Ooh. That's 100, yeah, by 150, 125, plus then 3 the next week, 42. $200,000 in 8 days, far less a month. No, sir. I am sure that there are a lot of other people providing the same goods and services that would have welcomed that opportunity. So much so, sir, that I have said to my colleagues that my perspective on this with respect to this Parliament is that as they go to tender, that we must seek to have 3 or 4 people awarded so as to rotate. I really feel so. Because these are difficult times. And everybody must have an opportunity to be able to keep their businesses afloat. But what makes this even more egregious, sir, is not only that there was no tender, but that I was a member of the Management Commission. That there were other members of the Barbados Labour Party who were members of the Management Commission at that time, and we were not invited to a meeting to discuss these matters. Similarly, the Attorney General made a document of the House, the Public Accounts Committee report. And this chamber, under a previous government, chose to so ignore the standing orders of the House, which were clear as to what happens when a report is laid. We were advised, we expected a certain course of events to take place, and far from taking place, the report has never been published as required by the standing orders of this House once the report is laid. I am asking for the leader of government business not to accept that it simply can be a document of the House, but that this Parliament must find, with the advice of the clerk and the clerks at the table, a manner in which that report can properly become a part of the records of this House. Because it is in being claimed by this House that the privileges that attach to the report can be claimed, such that persons may have a sensible discussion on what transpired with respect to that report. And if we have to seek advice from the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association as well, let us do so. But what cannot happen is that 5-6 feet of evidence taken over 3.5 years be allowed to languish and gather dust in circumstances where there were not just contracts signed and things done without appropriate processes, a total and complete breakdown in the governance of the National Housing Corporation and indeed of the Ministry of Housing, and in some instances cabinet government, because a minister of the Crown, one well known to the member for St. Philip North because she relieved the country of him, the burden of him, could go and write a letter to his chairman indicating that the cabinet took a decision to terminate a contract of tens of millions of dollars and to appoint somebody else for the same contract at even a greater price than the one that was terminated. And when the yellow paper came, because for those who don't know, the yellow paper is the official cabinet decision that is sent to the ministry from cabinet office, the yellow paper said simply, the minister updated cabinet on the project. Oh, sir, I have been around for a long time, but I don't know how the word update and terminate can equate, or update and appoint can terminate, can equate. And a prime minister learns of this within days, at least weeks, for sure, of the re-election of the government, and the minister is rewarded by going to another ministry, the Ministry of Transport and Works, from which then the Attorney General and others have told us that there are investigations going on because one contractor at the Ministry of Public Works over at the Transport Board over a period of 10 years, of which this new minister would have been responsible for 5 years and 3 months. Don't get tied up. 5 years and almost 3 months. that this one contractor, and I can only go with what the Attorney General has said because I've not had a chance to see those files yet. But one contractor could get as much as $28 million without it going to tender. $28 million, and that his bills were paid promptly, while UCAL's bills for doing the same mechanical work continue to languish to the point where UCAL, last week, we are trying to resolve the arrears owed to UCAL because they are struggling, because the weight of the debt is in excess of how much? 16 million dollars as we speak. But $28 million over 10 years to one private individual who, by the way, happens to be the same private individual owning the 2 BMWs that were driven by the 2 ministers affected. Mr. Speaker, when I talk about us trying to bring back one Barbados, it is because there are people in the farm. There are people in the same Marleyville. There are people in the garden land. There are people all about Barbados who, apart from not being able to buy a bicycle, who cannot escape the long arm of the law and should not if they have broken the law. But they then wonder, how does this kind of activity be spoken about? And I want to say to the leader of the opposition, because I hear him asking some questions yesterday too, that when you ask questions, let it be on the basis of work done. When I spoke about the 2 BMW X5 Jeeps, we had already done the work to see who was the owner and had all of the information. We knew who was driving them, we knew who owned them. When I spoke about the South Coast Sewage Project and asked the Prime Minister to call me, as he then was, the former member for St. Michael South, at Foundation School, it was because we had done the work. It wasn't a fishing expedition. And I want to say that against that background, because I am not going to let things fester or impressions be given with respect to innuendo that would cause people to feel that something untoward is happening. And I heard him the first time, and I'm now hearing him the second time with respect to White Oak. And White Oak is a company that has been involved in a number of countries with respect to debt restructuring. And let's deal with them. Belize, Ecuador, Grenada, Iceland, Mozambique, Pakistan, Seychelles, Suriname, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia. And before they became White Oak, the two principals, Sebastian Espinosa and David Nagasaki, worked with firms in other restructurings in the Dominican Republic, Jordan, Liberia, and the former Yugoslavia. Mr. Speaker, sir, I have made this document a document of the House. Because in Mozambique, they're still working as we speak. In Barbados, they're still working as we speak. In Belize, they were responsible, along with others, for the restructuring of sovereign bonds. In Grenada, it was them alone. In Ukraine, it was them with other advisors. In Belize, it was them alone. In St. Kitts and Nevis, it was them alone. In Greece, it was them and others, and Greece is the one that perhaps is the most famous in the world, or infamous if you want to call it that. In Seychelles, it was them alone, and Seychelles has been so successful that Seychelles has people running it down to come back to the capital markets. In Cote d'Ivoire, it was them and others. In Belize, again, in 2007, because remember, Belize had 2 debt restructurings. it was them as part of a team. In the Dominican Republic in 2005, it was them as part of a team. In Grenada, also which had 2 debt restructurings in 2005, they were part of a team, and they were part of a team in Argentina. Mr. Speaker, this is to be made a document of the House. This government will not hide behind anything. And I think that the member for St. Michael West knows me well enough and knows also for the team to which he used to belong and what obtained in the rooms that he used to sit in, to know that we are not going to foist on the people of Barbados anything that cannot be defended under the light of day. And that those who choose to whisper in his ear ought to have the courage to come out in public and say what they want him to say.
Interrupt the Honourable Prime Minister, because I think she's doing very well and batting solidly in relation to this issue of integrity in public life and what the lack of it implies for this country.
What's the point of order?
Point of order,
Member.
she's misleading the House by going beyond insinuation and in fact saying people are whispering in my ears. I asked in this House, as is my right to do, a legitimate question, simply because, as she stated, I have every confidence in that side that they will not seek to voice anything upon the people of Barbados, and hence the question.
Mr. Speaker, I am immediately willing to remove from this House any insinuation of anybody whispering in the ear of the member for St. Michael West, because I believe that in so doing, he is now telling me that he is prepared to do the investigations and research himself before making allegations that can be easily understood and found out on his own had he done the investigations. Because if he had done it...
What allegation have I made? I've simply said in here, as is my right to do. When the other administration ran this country as the government, we asked them to be clear, open, and candid with the people. Cahill left a bad taste in our mouths. Tell the people of Barbados about White Oaks. That's all I said. No allegation.
Speaker, sir, I have been in public life too long, and the honourable member is a man of the cloth, and therefore he understands the importance of juxtaposition of words. When he seeks to speak about White Oak in the same sentence that he does with Cahill, don't tell me that you are not seeking to cast innuendo on the quality and integrity of this government. If you want to ask about White Oak, ask about it in the context of Massey. Ask about it in the context of Grace Kennedy. Ask about it in the context of Royal Bank of Canada, or First Citizens, or First Caribbean. But when you choose to ask about White Oak, a company that is purely in the business of debt restructuring. And what is more, I have confidence because these gentlemen have presented to the Social Partnership of Barbados. The member for St. Peter, the member for St. Michael's South Central, and the member for Christchurch East Central can attest to that. So that anybody picking up a newspaper and hearing the word Cahill and hearing the word White Oak would believe that the two of them is pitch marbles together, that the two of them keep company together. And the member knows better than that, because the member is a gentleman in whom I have tremendous respect. He really is. But when you seek to put those two together, if he did not intend that interpretation, then he needs to get up and say so categorically.
Point of order, sir.
I thought clearly that I had said that. We could go back and forth on this all day. I simply asked a question, which I think any high school student in Barbados would ask in responding to the mention of Cahill being used as an instrument on behalf of this country with reference to our credit situation overseas. I simply asked, tell us who's White Oaks. It was the first time I'd even heard about them. Tell us who's White Oaks in the interest of the government's own position of trying to be open with the people of Barbados, and let's not have people talk about Cahill and all the rest. No juxtaposition intended to cast any negative shadow of what you're doing. Not at all. A sincere, genuine, and legitimate question.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I just want the honourable member to know that he might have gotten accustomed to seeing a Prime Minister in here who did not relate to a leader of opposition in good faith. I have already told the member that unlike my predecessor, immediate predecessor in office, that he will be shared with information. And I will be the first, if he says today that he wants a briefing, as soon as White Oak returns to the country next week, I will arrange for White Oak to brief him and his senators. Let it be known. And I would have liked the former Prime Minister to at least have addressed the issue of Cahill far less, and I would have loved the opportunity to cross-examine the principles of Cahill. You can't use the two in the same sentence and not believe that people are not going to think untoward things. It is naive, and if it is that that's not what he intended, I accept it and I move on now. But it cannot be, because this government is working too hard, not just to defend the country, but to try and restore a level of integrity and to bring a level of transparency and accountability to this country, because the country cannot survive without it. It cannot survive. Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to get into all. The Attorney General has joined us now. I've spoken about the 28 million that he is to show me the files on shortly. But at sanitation, the same person would have received almost $1 million in the last 3 years of that government's administration. The same ministry that also had a minister driving the same X5. And when we raised it, you know what is the most amazing thing, sir? And that's why I asked about that Public Accounts Committee report being able to have the full privilege of this House. When we first raised the issue of the 2 vehicles, made it a document of the House and everything, and even before, the newspapers did not want to carry it. So that a country labored for 4 years on the basis of something that could only be whispered or only fall out the mouth of an opposition leader. Don't talk about CBC. They couldn't even, other than the once a year, where you couldn't get away from carrying the leader of the opposition in here, there was nothing. You now have a CBC that carries every single lunchtime lecture of the Democratic Labour Party, even now when they do not even have a seat in Parliament. And I am not going to accept that people are going to label this Barbados Labour Party in the same sentence with the Democratic Labour Party as the member tried to label White Oak with Cahill. Mr. Speaker, sir, the bottom line is that we will do our best. Will we reach 100%? No, we will not. But when I find out that there have been things that we need to deal with, I keep making the point that I learned well as a Minister of Education and as an Attorney General. You don't know what a single teacher might do out of the 4,000 teachers that you have a responsibility for in a system. But what you do know is that if something happens, that you have a responsibility to deal with it. You don't know what may happen in a police force of 1,400 people, but what you do know is that if something happens, you have to do something about it, because as minister, you are ultimately accountable to this Parliament and to the people of the country for the conduct of the ministry. That is what ministerial responsibility means. And this government is going to restore collective responsibility too, and not just ministerial responsibility. This notion, Mr. Speaker, of ministers speaking wildly in conflict with each other and wildly in conflict with cabinet, as happened, the former member for St. James South. Every day he was in the paper talking one way. The member for St. Philip West, who they tell me maybe the new leader, He in the paper talking another way. The member for St. Michael Northwest, where he didn't talk unless he came in here to excoriate. Can't happen. Because when that happens, the people of the country have no confidence in the institution called government, and worse still, in the institution called cabinet. Cabinet is not a place where a vote is taken. Cabinet is a place where a consensus is reached. And a consensus is reached to allow persons to be able to express themselves with confidence that this is the decision of the cabinet, because people plan out their lives, people plan out their investments, people plan out their affairs on the basis of what is said. And that's why when a minister lies on cabinet, it is the ultimate breach. It is the worst breach in a democracy. Even more than stealing. The lying on a decision of cabinet is the worst possible breach, sir. It is like a priest disavowing his vows. We expect people to operate at a certain standard. And I say, sir, that we will not be consumed with vengeance. We will not be consumed with trying to fight everything, because there's just not enough time in the day. And we are equally conscious, and I say this, I said it Sunday in the interview that I did, and I say it again. There are some things that we will have to approach through a civil process, because one, not to do so would leave a level of liability on the accounts of the government of Barbados that is incapable of being borne. Incapable of being borne. There were a number of contracts signed in the last few months that were egregious in the extreme, and some even before. And that if the government of Barbados were now to accept the full contingent liability becoming real for those contracts, Mr. Speaker, sir, our debt situation would be that much worse. Our arrears, which is already, as I said, close to 1.9 billion, although we accept some of that is to other government institutions like the NIS, which is owed almost $500 million. We would be in a worse situation. And therefore, we have already asked people to walk back from some of these contracts because we cannot afford them. And there are still others that I said that we are about to do and to negotiate with, because we need people to walk away from them, to forbear, to move off, take them from the balance sheets as a contingent or a real liability, because the country can't bear the weight. And all of this as we go through debt restructuring and as we go through trying to settle an IMF program. Mr. Speaker, to the extent, therefore, that the AG can help negotiate, along with the Ministry of Finance, those forbearance or compromise agreements, as they may come to be known, they have to be done. Because I am more committed to making sure that people can walk forward with confidence and with hope than I am in seeking vengeance. I have no interest in vengeance. But I have an interest in making sure that Barbadians receive the full opportunity for development. And this is not to be interpreted as the AG not going ahead with the ones for which there is clear evidence. I've said it before he came. And if there's clear evidence for misfeasance in public office or malfeasance in public office, then he must act. If there's evidence for hire, then he must equally act too. And there are instances that are still the subject of investigation. A contract was signed to do almost $15 million in work at Sherman at the Lloyd Erskine Sandiford Center to accommodate government offices, including the Prime Minister's office and cabinet. Not to build the building, you know, sir. To outfit offices. No contract. Sorry, no tender. No public tender. And in circumstances, sir, where also some of the professionals were then removed from the project too. Professionals who would otherwise protect the integrity of the costing of the project. Mercifully, it seems as though only $5 million or less was spent, and we have put a pause to it for all kinds of reasons. Sir, this is what this government has inherited. And I give this country the assurance through you, sir, that we will not be obsessed with just looking for evidence, because we have a country to run and a people to fulfill with promises of development. But we will hold people accountable where the evidence is there. And we will also pursue a path of civil forbearance and compromise simply in the interest of the financial health of this country that cannot bear a $500 million sugar factory or cannot bear an almost $200 million burst 6 that never went to tender, or cannot bear some of the other contracts that we are now about the full weight of, certainly the cost of it. Even if we can't get rid of liability in some instances, we have to reduce the costs to government. And that's why I have asked the Attorney General to establish something called a College of Negotiators by having a team of people. He's already started it with the lawyers. We need to have it with the accountants. We need to have it with the quantity surveyors, the engineers, because the government of Barbados must have access to the best negotiating skills to negotiate in the public interest. This notion that the government of Barbados is to be jerked, sorry, to be pushed against the wall and ravaged, can't happen. There's a public interest that has to be defended. And if we do that, look, business operates on people having a reasonable rate of return. Nobody stays in business to make a loss, or should not, unless something untoward is happening. So we accept that people must have a reasonable rate of return. There's a higher end and there's a lower end, and there's an average. In some instances, depending on what side of the negotiating table you are, you will make a case elsewhere. And where you are in the negotiations and your level of need determines whether you are prepared to hold out to get at the lower end of the spectrum, or whether there is an urgency such that you are prepared to come at the higher end of the spectrum because of the urgency of the situation. These things are normal. And what we will not do, however, is have people get rates of return of 200% and 300% on the taxpayers. And then the taxpayers can't get toilet paper in schools, can't get basic supplies in a hospital. A hospital is undersupplied by almost under provision for almost 12 years by $40, $50 million for all kinds of reasons. I'm not getting into why now, but the cumulative effect of the under-provisioning of the hospital moves it from being the premier institution in the Eastern and Southern Caribbean to one that is fighting up just to provide basic services to its citizenry, where it is the lone major hospital that the people have to rely on. It cannot work in this country anymore. Now, the last thing that I want to address, sir, is the issue of whistleblower legislation and framework for it. This legislation touches it in part. But I believe, sir, that we need, when it goes to select committee, to have it strengthened. And the Attorney General will, I think the government will make the point that this bill will go to select committee now. We hope for no more than 2 months, that it will be back here by October. And it is going there to allow persons to be able to make submissions to it. The government and the leader of the opposition in the parliament and the independent senators in The Senate, along with representatives of the government and the opposition, will constitute a joint select committee in order to be able to take evidence from the wider Barbadian public on the provisions of this legislation. For us as a party, we put this out pursuant to the commitment I gave at annual conference at Queen's Park last year. This went out in November. People came forward, we are conscious and we thank them for that, but we also appreciate that people will be more responsive to a government and a parliament than they were to an opposition party. And to that extent, therefore, during the course of any summer recess, we feel that this will be put out there because this will come to govern the conduct of public officials across the spectrum going forward. And the country, therefore, must take this decision with its eyes wide open, conscious that in the initial stages there may be a fall-off in those who want to give public service, but confident that in the medium to long term, that there will be a recognition that this is inextricably linked to positions of trust, whether in government, the church, or non-governmental organizations, or indeed private employment. And I hope, sir, therefore, that we can move forward with a level of confidence, and that when we get to the select committee, that we may be able to instill in it stronger provisions for whistleblowing. That persons may know, and we know some of them, they may not want to admit that we know them, but they may want to come forward and should want to come forward, as I said at the beginning, to be able to say, look, these things happened, they should not have happened, we regret that they happened. It's almost a truth and reconciliation moment has happened in South Africa. But we want to have the protection that we will not be prosecuted for coming forward and saying that these transgressions took place, and that we need the immunity to be able to clothe us so that we can put this behind us. Does this country give second chances? Yes, it does. I said so. Even when you're convicted, having been found guilty after pleading not guilty. All the more so if you come forward and confess up front that, look, something happened that should not have happened. And I say to those today through you, sir, that the Attorney General is available to take and listen to anyone in this country who recognizes that there's a come to Jesus moment that ought to happen for some people in this country. And that pending the passage of the legislation, that they may want to do a sealed statement and give it to the Attorney General. Really. Because we have to put this behind us at some point. And it is always better, as in the case of a family disciplining its own, as in the case of a person going before the law courts this morning, for you to say an incident has happened, it is something with which I am familiar, it is something with which I've had a part to play, but I wish now to beg for forgiveness and to move on. That is the best way. It's the least expensive way. And I can only appeal as leader, things in the past, not ongoing in transgressions, because immunity does not extend to today's transgression or tomorrow's, and recidivists are not treated in the same way as a first-time offender. And for those who don't know the meaning of the word recidivist, those who are repeat offenders, those who behave bad over and over and over, are treated differently in a family from those who just behave bad one day or one summer. These things are appreciated and known by every family and every individual in this country. So I'm not speaking above the heads of anyone. But I appeal as leader of this country to those who knew that they helped participate, because it takes two to clap. How much ever I do so, I'm not clapping. And if I do so alone, it is not misuse, it may be a form of theft. but it is not corruption in the other way that we have come to understand what transpired in a lot of these institutions. So I ask, sir, that persons examine their conscience and persons recognize, sir, that this government is prepared to give people the opportunity to come forward, ask for forgiveness, and let us move forward. If there are others who are part of the same transaction who choose not to come forward and they are found out, well, they will feel the full weight of the law as the law is to be determined. Because as I said at the beginning, there is one law in the country. What we will not do is look to find tens of millions of dollars to go on a witch hunt. We're not about that. But we will deal with the evidence that is before us, or that ought to be immediately before us through nothing more than a forensic audit in dealing with some of these institutions and some of these people who have taken this country for a ride. It must never happen again in the annals of our history. I am not saying that corruption will not find itself in the national landscape. It always will, regrettably, just like murders will never be removed from our national landscape. But what I am saying is that the wholesale plundering that took place with the fiat of a government must never happen in this country again. And what this legislation seeks simply to do is to create an institution that will hold each and every member of this institution, this parliament, each and every member of the executive, each and every permanent secretary or head of department, each and every chairman of a board. It seeks to hold people, judges, magistrates. It seeks to hold all of us who assume a leadership position, a fiduciary leadership position, accountable. And I trust and pray, sir, that unlike the previous attempts, when it reached the other place, that it will not fall. I pray that the leader of the opposition, therefore, will support it as he has said in other places, and that, therefore, it will get the requisite constitutional support as it needs to pass the Senate, such that by the month of October, at the very latest, this shall be the law of the land. I want to thank the members of my cabinet for agreeing in advance of legislation, for the declaration of assets in sealed envelopes being held, and in some instances where they are still awaiting accounting information to be held by the cabinet secretary, because by the end of this month, all of these things must be sealed away, even though there is no integrity commission potentially for another 3 months. This is leadership by example, and I thank my cabinet for it. And finally, sir, I thank the Honourable Attorney General, who really has displayed a level of leadership since the start of this government with respect to not just this matter, but I know that if I have had no sleep, he has had none either. He has worked with a level of commitment and discipline, reflecting a level-headed approach that has made me absolutely proud in the choice that I have made with him as Attorney General of this country. And I say so with all sincerity. But it also shows me, sir, why there was wisdom in also making sure that we have persons who can concentrate on portfolios. And then people say that they talk about a large government. Trust me, we got this, and I know what I'm doing. We need to have many hands make light work, because Barbados must be rescued as soon as possible. Thank you, I'm obliged to you. That's all right?
Honourable Member for Christchurch East Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to support this piece of legislation 100%, simply because Barbados today not just requires it, but the state of our country, the state of our economy, Mr. Speaker, we need this legislation. There's a sense in the country of relief given the result of the election. The country has seen this government at work, for what I'm told, the last 50-odd days. There's a sense of relief, Mr. Speaker. But let me say that Barbados, and remind the country that Barbados is in trouble. And this government is working to make sure that we can get to shore as quickly as possible. But we must never forget, Mr. Speaker, who capsized the boat. Because the waters that we are now in this country, Mr. Speaker, are certainly uncharted, but they are waters that we can navigate. And as we seek to get to shore, Mr. Speaker, there will be some amongst us who will attempt to help us to get to shore, perhaps hoping that we will forget who capsized the boat in the first place. But this government is serious about the rescue of this country. And in the last 10 years, Mr. Speaker, the lack of integrity in public life has brought us to a point where we not only have a debt problem, we have a fiscal problem, we also have a foreign reserve problem. And all of these problems are related, Mr. Speaker, as you just heard from the Honourable Prime Minister, of some of the conduct of previous members of the Democratic Labour Party government and how they conducted the affairs of this country. Now, Mr. Speaker, as I said, I fully support this piece of legislation because it is critical to ensuring that we can properly manage the affairs of this country and that a level of accountability is brought to bear. Now, I recall, and permit me, Mr. Speaker, through you to remind the country that in my younger days, some 15-odd years ago, when the previous Barbados Labour Party government was undertaking pension reform, I was a central bank economist at the time, and I recall doing the modeling, Mr. Speaker, with respect to the long-term trajectory in terms of where those reforms are likely to go and what should happen. And as I stand here today, Mr. Speaker, looking at how this potential debt restructuring will impact not just pensioners, but the entire country, and trying to juxtaposition where we were 15 years ago with respect to the state of the economy and the management of the affairs of the country, and remind the country that nowhere within that landscape, those scenarios that we were running 15 years ago, Mr. Speaker, the consequences of a lack of integrity in public life were not contemplated. Now, whilst we are here to seek to remedy a situation that has gone horribly wrong with respect to the state of affairs of this country, I want to remind this Parliament that whilst our intentions are honourable and indeed very noble, that we must not be complacent in these efforts. And whilst we are here to make sure that we can fix these problems, we must look forward with a keen eye to ensuring that this kind of thing does not happen again. And so I want to just share a few thoughts on the composition of the commission, because I believe how we structure this commission, Mr. Speaker, will indeed determine whether the public of Barbados believes that this commission will indeed work. And I want to say that during the course of the campaign, when this draft bill was released, and I read it, I was very intrigued at the fact that the Honourable Attorney General and the legal team of the party, along with some other legal professionals, put this bill together very quickly. But the one thing that concerned me at that time, Mr. Speaker, was because I knew that we were going to win the election. But the one thing that consumed me with respect to what I've seen from some of the discussions within the Public Accounts Committee was what would have happened, for example, had we won the election and brought this bill here, where a circumstance could have presented itself where perhaps the former member for St. Philip North, or the former member for St. Michael Northwest, or indeed the former member for Christchurch East, might have been, under some strange circumstance, be sitting in this chamber, and one of them might have been the leader of the opposition, and then we are asking them to have input through consultation, into forming this very integrity commission. And I'm happy that the people of Barbados, and certainly my colleagues for St. Michael Northwest, St. Philip North, and indeed Christchurch East, that they were able to alleviate my fears of that circumstance happening. Because I could not imagine, Mr. Speaker, we standing here today discussing this very important piece of legislation with those characters being a part of it. And that's why I say, Mr. Speaker, it is important that as we do this now, that we make sure, because we don't know what's going to happen at some point in the future with some set of people that might come along with different motives. And so as we seek to structure this commission now, I think we must make every attempt to insulate the commission from any future consideration that is very different from the intent that we want to have established today. And so I believe fundamentally, Mr. Speaker, that whilst the legislation is sound, it is sound, that the way that the Integrity Commission is to be constituted is fundamentally important to the public of Barbados believing that it will be effective. And so I just want to share a few thoughts on how I believe that can be done, especially given that the public of Barbados reposed their confidence in this Barbados Labour Party. It demonstrated that it wanted to be involved in the decision-making process of government. I think in so doing, we must revisit the way the commission is constituted and the process. Because I believe widening the public participation is key to improving the governance in the country, and this affords an opportunity for that participation, Mr. Speaker, to take place. And so I want to put on the table, whilst the Honourable Prime Minister has good intentions, and indeed my Member of Parliament, who is now the leader of the opposition, also has good intentions, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. And so therefore, I believe we must insulate this commission from any political, quote-unquote, interference, to the point where we allow credible institutions in this country through an electoral process, through the AGM process, whatever the case is, Mr. Speaker, that the selection of persons to come to serve on this Integrity Commission must have the widest possible public participation. I believe that to do that, Mr. Speaker, will bring confidence and to build confidence among the public of Barbados that we are taking this matter seriously, and not just a closed process where decisions are taken without the input of the very people who are asking for accountability in this country. And so I want to put on the table, certainly that as it relates to the accountant that that will sit on the commission, that through ICAB, that there be a requirement that every 3 years or so, the person that's being selected to serve as the accountant on the commission, that there should be a process in ICAB to select that person from amongst the professionals in the accounting profession to be able to select that person. Similarly, Mr. Speaker, I believe that with respect to the attorney who's supposed to sit in commission, that a similar process should come within the bar to elect that person who will be appointed to sit on the commission. Now, Mr. Speaker, the rest of the commission speaks to collaboration between the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. And there are 3 places, 3 members who are supposed to be appointed in that manner. And as I said, Mr. Speaker, I believe this is really an opportunity for us to trust in the people to be able to elect members of this commission, because it is the very people who have to have confidence, not just in the commission, but in its government, that the commission is allowed to perform its functions without reference to those in this chamber, from the perspective that if you are asking the commission not just to oversee what's happening in this chamber, but certainly across the landscape of those that we may wish to appoint to serve on the many boards and statutory corporations across this country, that the public of Barbados, Mr. Speaker, be allowed that opportunity. Now, I see here there's provision for a member of the clergy, and without getting into the details of the electoral process amongst the clergy, I know that there are many a building fund in this country, Mr. Speaker, that seems to be in question. And I would want to suggest that that we have a relook of this specific provision, and in its place, perhaps, and I think as it relates to this and the other 2, that we ask either the Barbados Association of Retired Persons, the credit union movement, as well as the labor movement through their own procedures, Mr. Speaker, that these 3 persons be selected or elected through a process from these broader perspectives, rather than limiting it to the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. Because I believe that the public will have much more confidence in this commission to carry out its mandate if the procedures that we use to select and appoint these persons come from the very heart of the public themselves, such that when the commission acts, it's not acting because the Prime Minister might have gotten his or her way going forward as to who may sit on the commission. But the confidence in the commission, Mr. Speaker, and the requirement for those persons then to report back to their various constituents, because these are credible institutions in this country, Mr. Speaker, that work, and I fundamentally believe will allow us to chart a way forward with respect to this commission. And I want to say categorically, Mr. Speaker, that I believe this is the appropriate way to deal with this matter, because the engagement of the very people of this country now is so critical for moving this process forward, that we, as a country, must now seek every opportunity to allow people to participate in this democracy. And I believe that this is too important to leave to politicians. And as I said, I have no issue with the current Prime Minister or even the current leader of the opposition in their wisdom to consult and select people. But I think that it would be remiss of us right now to not seize the opportunity to get the people involved in this process of establishing this Integrity Commission such that the Commission can set about its work knowing that it has the full backing of the people of Barbados. Mr. Speaker, as I said in the budgetary debate a few weeks ago, there's no economic strategy that would be successful when there's corrupt practices taking place. And I want to remind the public of Barbados, as certainly the Prime Minister did in her presentation a few moments ago, when decisions are being taken with respect to the allocation of hard-earned taxes by the people of this country for purposes that are clearly selfish and greedy of a few, what you witness is the deterioration of the delivery of public services, such that we've reached a stage in this country, Mr. Speaker, where the cost of the corruption has led us to the point where we now have to restructure our debt. And as we seek to restructure our debt, Mr. Speaker, there's a cost to restructuring our debt. There's a financial cost, there's an economic cost, there's a social cost, but there's also a psychological one, because Barbados has always been known, Mr. Speaker, for paying its bills. And prior to 2008, Mr. Speaker, the government of Barbados went about its business in a manner that gave confidence not just to consumers, but to business people, to investors, that we knew what we were doing. But over the last 10 years, Mr. Speaker, the conduct of the government and those associated with the government has placed Barbados now in a position where we are now seen as incapable of handling our own business. And so as we move forward, not just with the establishment of the Commission, but certainly with the way that the government conducts its procurement. And I am happy to report to you, Mr. Speaker, and to the House that I took a briefing on the procurement legislation, which is to come to Parliament perhaps in the next 2 to 3 months. That there are some very strong provisions to support the work of the Integrity Commission, which the new procurement bill will seek to instill. And so we are not just doing this in isolation, because the way that the government conducts its business, Mr. Speaker, is important to the way that this Integrity Commission will be able to do its work. And so therefore, these things go hand in hand, Mr. Speaker. This is a moment, I believe, for us to widen the participation of the public in this process. And it would be remiss of, I think, us as a government to miss that opportunity. We must take the people with us on this journey, because as we reach shore and safety, Mr. Speaker, the procedures that we now must undertake to make sure that where there's malfeasance, that those who are responsible for capsizing the boat, both metaphorically and physically, Mr. Speaker, that they are held accountable. It is not vengeance, it is justice, Mr. Speaker. It is justice. The people of this country have suffered at the indifference of the last government, Mr. Speaker. Suffered. Some of them have benefited from that indifference. And I heard the Honourable Prime Minister say that if you get a conscience, you should come forward. And yes, if you have a conscience, you should. But we cannot wait on them to develop that conscience, Mr. Speaker. And so therefore, the organs of government will work to make sure that as we go through this process of right-sizing government, of bringing some order back to the affairs of government, that those who orchestrated, Mr. Speaker, deliberately to bring harm to the people of Barbados, that justice, Mr. Speaker, must be done. We have quite a ways to go, Mr. Speaker, as far as this economic recovery is concerned. But psychologically, Mr. Speaker, this country has been scarred. And it's been scarred by people that eat souls like us, well, not like you, sir, but eat souls like us, pitch marbles, play cricket. Our people, Mr. Speaker. And so as we seek to restore a level of integrity in public life, to bring confidence to the young people that Barbados is worth fighting for, justice must be served, Mr. Speaker. Justice must be served. And however long it takes to bring people to justice, the people of Barbados must know that this commission will set about doing its work, because the confidence that is required, not just at the investor level, at the business level, and at the consumer level, will also be boosted when people believe that the people administering the affairs of the country are doing so in their interests. And Mr. Speaker, I want to say that the practice of economics and sound economic policy is often rooted, yes, in numbers, but it takes the confidence of people going about their business every day to determine the success of economic policy. And it is that confidence in the system of government, the system of governance, that will determine how quickly this Barbados recovers from this very bad episode over the last 10 years. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, the way that we constitute this commission, so long as we engage the people and involve the people in this will set us on the way, Mr. Speaker, to economic recovery. I'm obliged to you.
The honourable member for Christchurch South.
I'm obliged to you, sir. I rise to, first of all, congratulate the Honourable Attorney General and the member for St. Joseph on urgently bringing this legislation to the House. And of course, Your Honour will hear me say that I support the legislation. I congratulate him because he has met a public demand. It is fine for an Attorney General to bring legislation and to have that legislation press its way through both houses. But the other aspect to this initiative of the Attorney General is that it seems to me that the public has demanded that some order should be brought to the financial affairs of government. And I therefore congratulate the Attorney General for, in less than 3 months, responding to that public demand of urgency. you will permit me, I hope, to make the point that there may be several valid interpretations as to the result of the last election. I think that one of those valid interpretations is that the result reflects a public revulsion against what was clearly the stench of corruption in government in this country. I do not myself come to you today with any evidence. I cannot make such claims, except to remind you that the public believes that the last government was an extremely corrupt government. And the public believes that it is the duty of this Parliament to bring some order to the financial affairs in government. A lot of us, and the younger ones among us, of whom I have not one, over the last weekend saw a video of a marauding gang across the sacred lawns of a cemetery. And apart from not understanding it, we were repulsed at the very thought that people could bring themselves to that quality of conduct. I am no less repulsed that men and women in public life constitute themselves similarly as a marauding gang across the sacred territory of the public finances of a country. Every government is meant to be a trustee, not only largely for the people's interests, but public monies are sacred. Those young men, and I understand there were a few women on the scene, were televised. The last government had the luxury of not being televised. Reminds me of the song by Gil Scott-Heron when he says the revolution will not be televised. Well, what this last government did was not televised. And that is why I say to you, Your Honor, I have no evidence, except, as I've said before, the public believes what the public believes, perhaps on strong circumstantial evidence, and therefore, this House must do today what it is doing. We have no choice except to do what we are doing today. To come to the legislation itself, and I shall be brief on this. Every bill which hopes to find life of an act, as an act of Parliament has a title, and the title of this bill, Mr. Speaker, is Integrity in Public Life Act 2018. We lawyers refer to that as the short title. But in every bill and in every act of Parliament, there is a portion which is described by us as the long title. And it is that long title that seeks to give explanation to the glibness of a short title. Permit me, Your Honor, to reflect on that long title. And it reads as follows: an act to establish a regime, including an integrity commission, to promote the integrity of persons in public life and strengthen measures for the prevention, detection, investigation, and prosecution of acts of corruption. The operative word on which I wish to focus is the word promote. It says that this act, presently a bill, seeks to promote the integrity of persons in public life. The bill itself makes the confession that it can give no guarantee that persons shall conduct themselves with integrity. All it says is that it seeks to promote it, so that the bill itself accords with the truism that you cannot legislate integrity, neither in private life nor indeed in public life. And so, if there is any dilemma, that is where the dilemma exists. That while you may hope for a man's integrity, you cannot legislate it. So persons may come here with their hearts, and they may render their hearts to public service such as they are. But this bill, hoping to become an act, and I have no doubt it will become an act, seeks to establish an architecture that will ultimately control the conduct of men and women who dispose themselves to public service. And so the long title gives explanation to the short title. But I think, Your Honor, that beyond the four corners of the Act, this House is entitled to some further explanation of the conduct that besmirched and defiled the public life of Barbados over the last 10 years. As I've said, I am absolutely certain that the result of the last election, it is unprecedented, that the result of the last election reflects that public revulsion against the stench of corruption that afflicted this country. I want to root that behavior, and we must say to the public that that behavior will never be repeated. Never be repeated. Certainly not in this administration, and certainly not in the public life of Barbados. 30 Love is the most damning statement against a government that used to have numbers. Not one of them can make his presence felt in here today. And that is a damning statement against a government. I'm not speaking of a party, but that is a damning statement against a government, many of whom are still young men and young women. But how did they get into that position? Your Honor, please permit me to root the reputation of that last government in a statement made by their now deceased leader. He came to them and told them, perhaps it was his credo, that you must not intellectualize politics. And that is a dangerous statement. That is dangerous language. I submit to you today, sir, that that statement of the former leader and the former Prime Minister of this Parliament and of this country, that statement created a climate of vulgarity, the vulgarity that is corruption, among his government, or within the four corners of his government. How do you tell a man who is involved in any activity whatsoever not to intellectualize it? The problem is, we seem to believe that the word intellectual relates itself to matters abstract. That is not so. If you go to a boat builder in Oistins today, a man who is building a large wooden boat, he cannot complete that task unless he uses his intellect. It is not simply a matter of knocking nails into wood. It is an intellectual activity. How does a man create something that braves the elements, the wind, the rain, the waves? It involves mathematics. It involves geometry. That a man builds something out of wood that goes 100 miles off Barbados and finds perfect balance, and also finds that it is safe against leakage For him to build that, that is no easy exercise. He engages his intellect in a very serious way to create that thing of beauty. Over the last weekend, I saw a house being constructed in my neighborhood. And when they reached, I suspect you know these terms, sir, when they reach ring beam, that is where it becomes absolutely fascinating. They take a piece of wood and it goes up the middle of the house. This is the carpenter. And you know the story. For him to construct that roof, and they tell me, the good carpenters tell me, that a roof basically supports itself. It is nothing that a man without an intellect can do. You must have an intellect for that roof to be perfectly balanced, to sit, those beams to support themselves. The point is to watch a carpenter build a roof is a most admirable activity that he undertakes. Again, from the boat builder to the carpenter. He cannot proceed to create that thing of finished beauty unless he employs the intellect. Good common sense, good mathematical principles, all that he has learned, he brings that together in an intellectual exercise. He engages the mind. The word they use today, it is a cognitive exercise. He engages the mind to create that thing of beauty. So is his foreman going to come to him one day and say, not to intellectualize his activity? He must intellectualize his activity. But the foreman, and I insist he's the foreman of the last government, he told his troops not to intellectualize their activity. This is not about reason. This is not about moral purpose, because I want to submit to you today, Your Honor, that every man and woman that comes to public service does not come properly prepared unless he or she comes with moral purpose. There must be a purpose, and I suggest to you, I submit to you today, sir, that that purpose must be moral. You must be able to defend it against principles of righteousness and justice and things that are good for all mankind and all people who are in search of fairness and fair play and justice. That is moral purpose, Your Honor. And so, when he told his members not to intellectualize politics, it was to engage vulgarity in its worst manifestation. And therefore, men who come to public service with that quality of thought or lack of thought must necessarily find themselves disposed to corrupt practices. There's no honor and beauty in what they pursue. There's no moral purpose. The leader has exhorted them against intellectual activity. The kind of intellectual activity that gives formation to the beauty of a boat that sails on the ocean. The kind of intellectual activity that gives stability to a roof against all hurricanes and all forms of bad weather, rain and tempests. Yet, that is how they came to public life in Barbados. And I want to again caution this government against rooting itself in those purposes, or in those practices, in those philosophies that negate the value of moral purpose, that negate the value of intellectual engagement. All work is intellectual. Public service is work, and public service is intellectual work. You're dealing with people, and you're dealing with people's problems, and you're dealing with public finances, and you're dealing with how those public finances ought to be distributed among the various sectors of society. That is intellectual work. And the high point, or should I say the low point, of the former Prime Minister's edict or dictum to his members was when he followed on that by the enticement that public service was to be characterized by the search for a piece of the fatted calf. I used the word vulgarity earlier. There has never been a more vulgar statement made in relation to public service. That one, you abandon the use of the mind, you abandon morality, you abandon values, you abandon the intellect, and you go in search of the vulgar. You go in search of material gain for yourself. And that is what the last election was about. It was a public revolt against men and women who were not interested in the country, but were interested in self. 30 love is no mean statement. And I know that I don't have to caution. That's true.
You have a good time remaining, sir. I remember you have good time. Continue, please.
No, I didn't wish to.
Continue, please, Honourable
Thank you very
Member.
much. Thank you very much. I was not that I was hoping to hear what the clerk was saying to you.
Honourable Member, please continue.
I am obliged to you, sir. But I was indicating that the result of the last election certainly is a reminder to this country and to this House as to the kind of revolt that is possible when we in public life do not conduct ourselves with probity. And so we must not be afraid of integrity legislation. My learned friend, I beg your pardon, my colleague, the member for St. Michael North, says, if 10 to 1 is murder, he himself does not know how you define 30 to 0. But again, I say that 30-0 constitutes a revolt, not against incompetence, because we've had incompetent governments in the past. Perhaps it is not even a revolt against laziness. We've had lazy governments in the past. But every Barbadian who is meeting us on the roads are now telling us, every Barbadian is now telling us, I beg your pardon, that we must pursue, we must do two things. Ensure that that conduct does not repeat itself, and ensure that justice should be done in relation to those who perpetrated fraud upon the public finances of this country. You have given me a lot of time, sir. I don't think I need a lot of time today.
The rules give you a lot of time, sir. I remember.
All I would say to this House today, sir, is that this legislation should be our covenant, our new covenant with the public of Barbados, that our conduct will be proprietous, that there shall be rectitude in the way we conduct ourselves. And personally, I want to say to you that the cautionary sermon of Reverend Jerry Seal was well given at Bay Street on the Sunday when my colleagues were sworn in. And if we ever believe that we're in the midst of some honeymoon, I certainly don't believe in them, in politics anyhow, but that the public never ceases to be watchful of their governments, even if they give them 30-0. And certainly Reverend Seal's sermon was a reminder that this country will have no tolerance for corruption in government. And therefore, this legislation does not trouble me in the least. I believe I will have some say within a select committee. I do not often speak of my own professional exploits, but permit me today, sir, to claim some little qualification in these matters to speak, not qualified as a perpetrator, but qualified as a man who has been professionally engaged in matters of public corruption when they came to the courts. And so I bring that experience, that professional experience, to this exercise. And I promise you, Your Honor, that I will be very active when the time comes in exercising my intellect towards the safe and good passage of this legislation. I promise you that, sir. And to say to this country again that service and good public service is a thing of beauty. It is the aesthetic, almost. And that the moment that you disengage your intellect is the moment that you expose yourself to vulgarity, the vulgarity of corruption, and that this is a government which will not abandon intellect. That this is a government which will run counter to the principles as articulated by our now deceased Prime Minister. And that there shall be probity that shall characterize this very busy and industrious government. And I certainly, for myself, am proud to be a part of this Parliament at this time. I am proud to be the representative for Christchurch South at this time. I am proud to be the representative of a constituency that sent repeatedly and over many years a standard bearer for integrity in public life. And I pause to pay tribute to Sir Harold Bernard St. John. You will permit me to repeat what I've said in other places, that this is a man who so valued integrity in public life that he sacrificed, I can't say this to you, sir, he sacrificed the outcome of an election against the urgings of his colleagues within the bosom of the party headquarters. They were saying to him to tinker with numbers. They were saying to him, and this is no criticism of them, this is praise for him. They were urging him to liberalize taxation. And they were saying to him that if he did that the people of Barbados were so fickle that it was likely to secure an election victory. And his response was that if they wished him to do that they could and should have to remove the cup of leadership from his lips. He was prepared to sacrifice the leadership of the party, and ultimately, he sacrificed prime ministerial leadership for the sake of integrity in public life. I am profoundly proud. My shoes cannot fill the footsteps of that gentleman. But I can promise you, Your Honor, that I intend to walk in his footsteps when it comes to disposing myself with integrity in public life, and that my intellect must be carried with me, whatever is its quality. I will not abandon reason, I will not abandon cognitive engagement, and I certainly will not abandon moral purpose. Because I believe that there certainly is a correlation between intellect and integrity. I believe that. and I urge all of my colleagues, whether there's a honeymoon or otherwise, to maintain the level or the quality of probity with which they have visited this country in less than 3 months in office. This is an admirable government that has gone about to fix the wrongs that afflicted this country over the last 10 years. And they have done it. And they will not claim to be more competent than any other person. But what they will claim by the symbolic passage of this legislation is that they come with pure hearts. They will claim to you, Your Honor, that they will engage their intellect. And they will come to you, as the legislation says, they will come to you demonstrating that there shall be integrity in the public life of Barbados. And that is a government of which I am proud to be a member. And so, my personal congratulation, and my congratulation from this place, is for the Attorney General who has brought this legislation to the House. You are aware, Your Honor, that the last government brought similar legislation to the House. And if we smile at the destiny of that legislation. It is now an academic document consigned to the dustbins of history. I am not arguing a case for nor against them, but the people of Barbados will ask the logical question: why do you pass legislation to promote integrity in public life, and that legislation cannot enjoy the signature that brings it into proclamation, that brings it into life? The legislation that they felt constrained to pass. Why? The public wants to know, why did it not find life? And while it was struggling for life, it seems, I have no evidence, but it seems that like that gang at Coral Ridge last weekend, certain persons were marauding across the quietude, sanctity, and sacredness of the public finances in this country. And that is what this good government has inherited. I've listened to my friend from the Honourable Member for Christchurch East Central, and he sits particularly and peculiarly in a position in his ministry where I'm sure he will discover much, where I'm sure the burden is on him to recover much from what this country has endured. I've listened to him very carefully, and I wish him all the best. I really do wish him all the best.
The Honourable Member has 2 more minutes.
I thank you so much, sir. I do wish him all the best in his effort to rescue the public finances of this country and to join with all the members in this House, including the Leader of the Opposition, to give public guarantee that the public finances of this country shall from here on be well safeguarded, whether this act comes into being next week, next month, or in December, that this shall continue to be good government. This shall continue to be government that employs the intellect. This shall continue to be government that employs the intellect to create the beauty of a finished product and to avoid the vulgarity of corruption. I'm obliged to you, Your Honor.
The Honourable Member for St. Peter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support completely this Integrity in Public Life bill that is before the Chamber today and has been for a little while. I rise to support it, sir, because leadership, if it is to be effective, leadership, if it is to make sense to those led, leadership, if it is to build capacity, build people, must be grounded must be founded in integrity. And when I hear the word integrity, my mind goes in a couple of directions, but in one situation, it goes to a passage in the book of Job, where after quite a bit of suffering, God is able to say of Job, he still retains his integrity. And the reason why, Mr. Speaker, I mention that passage of scripture is because as I go through St. Peter, and as I speak to constituents, especially the ordinary people of St. Peter, one of the things that upsets them, and sometimes offends them, is that the idea of bad behavior is sometimes associated with poverty or having limited means. And they say to me, Mr. Speaker, that what they believe they've seen over the past 10 years, what many Barbadians now refer to as the lost decade rather than the last decade, what they are seeing or what they believe they've seen is not opportunism, but rather crass, unethical, almost criminal behavior in public life. And they have sent me here to say to this chamber and to say to Barbados generally that they are not prepared, and the last speaker, the Honourable Member for Christchurch South, would have said similar. They are not prepared to accept that kind of behavior from those they elect to lead and to manage the affairs of this country. And they will no longer accept that kind of behavior. But I repeat, Mr. Speaker, that integrity is fundamental, not just to human behavior, but especially to leadership. And we have been elected, and those who have served in this honorable chamber and those who serve in the other place as well, have been elected or asked to serve, to be good stewards, to manage the affairs and to manage the resources of this country. And therefore, those who have elected us, or those who have selected those in the other place, have placed a significant amount of responsibility and have committed to us and to them a level of trust. And they expect us to be faithful to the trust that they have placed in us. We are managing their resources, and they expect us to manage those resources, their resources, with a measure of integrity. As leaders, we are held, and I will say properly so, to a high standard. We are held sometimes to a higher standard than persons in other occupations at other levels of society. And it is proper that we are, because we are in a position to either use effectively and efficiently and ethically, or to misuse significant amounts of resources. And so when we as members in this honorable chamber are held to that higher standard, I say we are properly held to that higher standard. And so this bill, the Integrity in Public Life Bill, is a bill that seeks to codify the views of Barbadians. Those views that say those of us who are here must act with integrity, must act with honesty, and must be faithful to the calling and to the responsibility that has been placed upon us. Now, some of my colleagues, Mr. Speaker, have spoken to the cost of unethical behavior, behavior that is lacking in integrity. There are some costs that I would wish to mention to you, Mr. Speaker. And one of those is the cost to the fabric of society. Because when we see what the last honorable member who referred to the marauding gang, when we see certain kinds of behavior manifesting themselves in our society, we sometimes have to ask the question, why do people sometimes feel emboldened to do certain things? And I want to submit to you, Mr. Speaker, that there are times, and I'm not saying that it happens in every situation, but there are times when persons act in particular ways because they see those who have been entrusted with leadership acting in inappropriate ways, acting without integrity, acting as if there's no moral compass that guides them. And I say to this chamber that there are people looking on, and when those entrusted with leadership at this level, at the levels of permanent secretaries, at the levels of judges and magistrates, at the levels of heads of departments, at the levels of chairpersons of statutory boards, when those of us in these positions act badly, behave badly, misbehave, then those in the society sometimes see that as an indication that they too can behave badly. And so there is a cost to society for bad behavior. And that cost, one of the costs, is a destruction of the fabric of our society. And I want to say to those in our country who may feel that they are insulated just because they have wrought iron bars or just because they have alarm systems, I want to say to all of them, as well as to all of Barbados, that when the fabric of our society is destroyed, none of us is safe. None of us is secure. We have heard in the chamber, in the debate already, references to the costs more on an economic side, and we have heard that there's a cost as it relates to overcharging. Because if a business person pays more, and it is in relation to something that he or she will be charging for afterward, then to recoup what the overcharge is, the price of the final product has to increase. There's a cost not just to the macroeconomy, but lack of integrity creates a cost to the ordinary people of Barbados in the form of higher prices for goods and services because of what people call the fat or the bribes or whatever else has been built in to the cost somewhere further down the line. There's also a cost, Mr. Speaker, in the encouragement of business, well, I should put it a different way. The encouraging of corrupt business people in the society and in the economy. That is a cost because when bad behavior is allowed to continue, business people who have little or no scruples submerge to the top, as some former parliamentarian has said, and it also serves to discourage business people who want to act in an ethical manner. And so we find the business climate in the country beginning to take a turn that is not sustainable if the country is to grow and develop in a proper way. And I'm saying to the country, as I'm saying to this chamber, through you, Mr. Speaker, that these are costs that a young democracy cannot afford to bear. And the country must be aware that the reason why we are having this bill, why this bill is being debated, and why the bill, as the Prime Minister has indicated, we intend it to be proclaimed by the end of October. The reason why we're doing this is because we are intent on protecting this country. We are intent on seeing this country grow. We are intent on creating a sustainable country, not just for us, but for succeeding generations. I also want to say, Mr. Speaker, that when corrupt practices are obtained, when leaders act in a way that could be considered unethical or lacking integrity, there's also a cost as it relates to our standing among the family of nations. And I don't want us as a chamber or as a country to underestimate that cost. When, as we move around in international circles, we must remember that the family of nations often acts in a similar way as groups of friends. And so when once a country loses its standing, when it becomes seen as a quote-unquote banana republic, or a place where anything goes, your standing is lost and your ability to influence at the regional or at the international level is significantly reduced. That is a cost to the country because it can result in situations where you're not able to obtain benefits that you might otherwise obtain. And I'm saying to the chamber and to the country that we have to put in place legislation like the one we're debating, because as a country, and especially as a small country, as a small economy, a small society, we have to make sure that our systems are robust enough so that we can maintain a high standing among the family of nations. Now, the last government and certain members of the last government, as I watch debates on Tuesdays, debates taking place in this chamber, I often heard members of the last administration speak to a statement that I think is more familiar to those of the legal fraternity, that those who come to equity must come with clean hands. Now, I heard that statement repeated, and I heard it repeated often, but especially, Mr. Speaker, by persons who, as I went around Barbados, people were saying to me that those people who were using the statement, they did not think that they had clean hands. Now, I don't have any evidence. The Attorney General has not shared any information with me. But the public, members of the public, were saying to me that they did not understand this reference, this constant reference to clean hands. They did not, for example, understand what clean hands meant when people were given contracts of significant sums, and then those who give them the contracts were driving cars or vehicles, because they weren't cars, they were too big and used too much gasoline to be called cars. But those persons were driving vehicles registered to those same companies. And the people in Barbados who I'm talking to cannot understand where clean hands would fit in to that kind of activity. The people of Barbados were saying to me that they could not understand this constant reference to clean hands when multi-million-dollar contracts were being awarded without those contracts going to public tender. They could not understand what the reference to clean hands meant. They focus more on clean hands than coming to equity, because many average people do not understand what coming to equity means, but they do understand the reference to clean hands. And they say to me that hands cannot be clean when these large contracts appear to be given to friends of the government. And that is why, as our Prime Minister has said today, even a contract that speaks to the provisioning of Parliament must go out to tender, because this government, this Barbados Labour Party government, will not operate in a system or with a structure where persons can talk about clean hands but still award these contracts to their friends. Multi-millions of dollars, but no reference to any kind of transparent way of determining who receives the contracts. The people of St. Peter do not understand the reference to clean hands when, just before the last government is removed from office, they can sign contracts that are not yet expired, not yet within the period for which you would normally renew a contract, whether it is a month or 90 days, and renew contracts for multiple years. They do not understand the reference to coming to equity with clean hands when a government can engage in this kind of action. The people of St. Peter, and the people of Speightstown in particular, do not understand the reference to coming to equity with clean hands when, just before a general election, a government can engage in what they refer to as gymnastics and transfer Crown land to the National Housing Corporation, apparently with the intention of selling it to one of their friends and trying to do it all before the election without allowing others to have the opportunity, to have a real opportunity to bid for that parcel of land. The people do not understand the reference. And so the people are saying to this government that we must put systems in place to ensure that the infelicities, Prime Minister said, the Honourable Member for St. Michael Northeast, she couldn't use the word thieving. I can't use it either because, as I said, I don't have any evidence, but the people of Barbados and the people of St. Peter believe that that is what it is. And I'm not sure, I said to the member for St. Michael South, I don't know if thieving is good parliamentary language, so I'm not going to use it. But they believe that the bad behavior of the past, of the lost decade, must be remedied. And so having a piece of legislation like the Integrity in Public Life Bill, soon to be Act, is something that they support wholeheartedly. There is another cost to the lack of integrity in public life, to bad behavior in public life. When a potential investor can approach government wanting to do a development in the north of the country and be told by the government, in order to come back to see me, and I really need to be careful when they say government, because I work with a very good team of public servants. And I want to be clear, because government includes not just those of us who sit here or those who are in cabinet. Government also includes the public servants of this country. And I'm saying, and maybe I'm saying it parenthetically here, many public servants, some of whom the Prime Minister would have referred to this morning, who may have felt compelled to engage in bad behavior, I'm not referring to them. But I'm referring to those policymakers who would have engaged with those who wanted to invest in this country and said to them, in order for me to see you a second time, you must have as your advisor one of my friends. The cost to the country is that an investor like that, who has scruples, as we would say, will refuse to engage in the process. And so there is construction that could have happened that did not. There are persons from St. Peter, and I'm sure from St. Andrew and St. Lucie, who could have been employed in a project who were not. There is the situation where taxes could have been paid to the government, a government that did not have any money, but taxes that were not paid because decent investors refuse to engage with indecent ministers. And so that kind of cost is a cost that the people of St. Peter and the people of Barbados no longer prepared to pay. And so they've said to us, we fully support a piece of legislation that will seek to bring back to public life integrity, good behavior on the part of those who have been elected to serve this country. They see this, Mr. Speaker, in the context of a government that laid in this chamber a bill to get rid of the Public Accounts Committee. They see it in the context of a government whose leader, because he did not get his way, decided on his own that he wanted to pull out of the Caribbean Court of Justice. They see it within the context of a government that was running wild, drunk on its perception of being in charge, being in power. A government that had gone wild. This Barbados Labour Party government, and I want to use a reference from a document that I know is already being laid. It is already a document of this Honourable House. This Barbados Labour Party government, and it is a document that I know the Leader of the Opposition subscribes fully to. But in this document, the Covenant of Hope, a document that this party placed in the public domain and continues to refer to, because what we put in this document is what we intend to live by. And we've said in this document, Mr. Speaker, that all Barbadians must hold their leaders accountable. We in this honorable chamber are prepared to be held accountable by the people who sent us here. I have placed in a sealed envelope about 20 sheets of paper, 40 sheets of paper, a lot of sheets of paper, paper that does not reflect my assets. But you had to answer a lot of questions, and you answered 2 lines on one page and a few lines on another page. Maybe some of my colleagues would have filled out some of those sheets of paper. I didn't have to fill out many of those sheets of paper, but I've placed my information, and I've placed my wife's information and my children's information in a sealed envelope, because I am prepared, like the rest of my colleagues, to be held accountable by the people of Barbados. We've said in this document that we will have a government that is rooted in integrity. We have made a commitment to the country, and we have said that we are prepared to live by this covenant that we have made. We called it a covenant because for us, it is a serious document, and we are prepared to live by it because the people of Barbados have said to us, they, like us, are no longer prepared to live in a Barbados where leaders run amok, where leaders get on as though the funds and the resources that they are accountable for are their personal resources. They are no longer prepared to accept it. I want to say, as the minister responsible for social partnership relations, that all of the social partners must participate in this project of open, transparent government based on integrity. And I want to, in some ways, repeat some of what, well, a statement that the Honourable Member for St. Michael Northeast made. It takes two hands to clap. And so I am appealing to the business partner in the tripartite arrangement to stop offering inducements to ministers, to members of parliament, to senior public servants, to chairpersons of boards in this country. Because if nothing is offered, there's a reduced likelihood of something being taken. I've already spoken about the takers. And as far as I'm concerned, and I'm just reflecting, I'm a member of parliament. I'm a representative for over 8,000 people in St. Peter. And when I come here, I come to speak on their behalf. And they say that people who take should be locked up. That's what they're saying to me. But I'm saying to those who give, refrain from doing it. Refrain from offering inducements. As a matter of fact, I want to go further. We talked about whistleblower legislation. I would want them to put in the public domain every situation where they have been asked for some kind of bribe or whatever you call it, some kind of token to get their assent or to get their approval for some project of this sort. I want them to recognize that in this governance project, they are partners. They are partners.
The member has 2 more minutes.
My religious orientation tells me that legislation will not necessarily change personalities. Law does not necessarily change personality. But law and legislation says to all of us, this is acceptable, this is not acceptable. And so I am of the view that legislation is important, not necessarily to make unethical people ethical, but to regulate behavior in a society. And so we must have legislation like this one, integrity in public life, so that all participants, Barbadians of all persuasions, leaders in government, leaders in business, leaders in civil society, must understand there must be a standard that has been set that says this kind of behavior is acceptable, this kind of behavior is not acceptable. We as a government, we accept the responsibility of the people who have sent us here. And I want to say very quickly that this legislation is, in my view, this has the potential to be a very good piece of legislation. There is provision for ensuring that frivolity does not take place. And at section 59, there is provision for dealing with those persons who willfully or maliciously make false accusations. So I say that to say to those of us in public life, including those who may be having second thoughts about serving at the level of chair of boards, there is a heavy penalty for those who make scurrilous claims, claims without foundation. I'm saying that because the legislation, balanced as it is, seeks to create a situation where those of us called to serve at this level behave properly, but we are also protected against people who will just want to sully your character from coming forward and making some spurious accusation. It also includes at section 61 a duty to report. And I like that section because I think it is time that we Barbadians, we usually like to talk about not taking bread out of people's mouths. But we have to recognize as Barbadians that when we allow bad behavior to continue and to corrupt an organization and a country, there is a cost to all of us. All of us will have bread taken out of our mouths. And so the inclusion of a section to compel persons or to encourage persons to report, I think is a good inclusion in this bill.
Could the honourable member please wind up, sir?
Yes, the honourable member will. And he will by saying to this honourable chamber that this piece of legislation is one that I commend to this House. It is one that the people of this country want. It is one that we, as a government and as a parliament, have committed ourselves to living by. And I look forward to the day when our standing as political leaders in the country, when our standing as a country within the family of nations is restored to the place where we all once stood, where people looked up to us, where they trusted us, and where they understood that we were leaders and we were from a country that stood on high principles and encouraged integrity in public life. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the suspension of today's sitting until 2:15 p.m.
The question is that this honourable chamber be suspended until 2:15 p.m. All those honourable members in favour, please say aye. All those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. This honourable chamber stands adjourned until 2:15 p.m.